First of all, my name is Bill Ollett. We have a special event. I want to ask about the audience first. How many of you are Sloan students? How many of you are from the School of Engineering or Science? Not enough, not enough. How many of you are otherwise? What is that? Alumni community? Staff. Okay. Well, great. We have a special event, and I want to just make it very quick introduction. I know Brad Feld. Brad Feld has been a very good friend to MIT and to entrepreneurs worldwide. He has helped us. When I launched my book, the first place I went to was Boulder. The book wasn't even out. And he said, sure, let's do it. And we had a great feedback there, which really helped us succeed around the world. But more importantly, whenever we have issues that we're dealing with, be it Global Founder Skills Accelerator, I call up Brad and say, Brad, what do you think about this? And he will respond, he will give me a very clear opinion. It's not always right, but it's very, very clear.
No need to be right.
It's overrated sometimes. But he went through MIT here. He got his bachelor's. He got his master's here. He was on his road to get a PhD. And then he realized he wanted to have an impact on the world. And frankly, the marginal benefit of continuing to get a PhD, I shouldn't say this, should I? All right, I won't. But he's had quite an impact on the world. And that has been noticed by many millions of people around the world. And so it's a great honor to have him back. He is bringing his uncle here, Charlie, who is
That's me with the suit.
who was the CIO at Frito-Lay and Pepsi, has worked very closely with one of the leaders in the business sector. And we'll talk about business and bringing business and innovation technology together, which is extremely appropriate for us here in the 02142 zip code. So it's our great honor. Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Charlie. To you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Just as a quick frame of reference, I'm currently a venture capital investor. I have a partnership called Foundry Group, which invests in early-stage companies all over the world. I'm also co-founder of Techstars, which is a mentor-driven accelerator, which has become the model for many of the accelerators around the world. And I think it's awesome that Bill started an accelerator here that is in that same mentor-driven, dynamic, very powerful approach. So those three companies that we're investors in that Bill's referring to are Zynga, which we were early stage investors in, Fitbit, which we're early stage investors in, and MakerBot. And for those of you that are intrigued with the innovation arc of a startup from raw startup, I'd encourage you to watch a Netflix documentary that just came up called Print the Legend. It highlights two companies, MakerBot and Formlabs. And Formlabs was an MIT Media Lab a company that came out of the MIT Media Lab. The two companies competed with each other. And it's very interesting, very powerful documentary on what it's really like to be in this emerging early stage startup. Charlie's been a CIO of many companies over the last 50 years, starting at Frito-Lay. But then he started his own company in the early 90s called the Feld Group and created a CIO for hire business where he and his team were CIOs for companies like Delta, Home Depot, Westinghouse, CBS, First Data. Charlie and I started working together. I learned computing at Charlie's feet. In fact, my first exposure to computers were in a basement of a Frito-Lay data center, programming on IBM 360 in APL when I was 10 years old. But Charlie took me around whenever he would have meetings with Digital or Lotus or other executives when I was a teenager and then living here and in college here. So I really got exposed to big company IT and how big organizations worked. And in 2000, I invested in Charlie's company, the Feld Group, and joined his board. So we got to work together for about 5 years as business partners, in addition to him being a very early mentor of mine and also knowing me since inception almost. And then EDS bought the Feld Group in 2005, and Charlie and his team were essentially the team that transformed EDS and led to their acquisition by HP. EDS didn't buy the Feld Group for the business. They bought it for the 50 or so leaders in the Feld Group that Charlie had built and nurtured. When Charlie this is Charlie's second book. His first book is called The Blind Spot, and it's a great encapsulation of his learnings about IT and how to be a CIO and how to be a leader in large organizations over many years. One of his mentors and bosses was Wayne Callaway. How many people here have heard of Wayne Callaway before this book? Okay. How many people here have heard of Jack Welch? Okay. Wayne Callaway generated more Fortune 1000 leaders than Jack Welch. And in fact, when Jack Welch was hired as CEO of GE, Wayne Callaway was on the GE board. And much of the leadership DNA came from Callaway's dynamic. Callaway died 2 years after he retired from Pepsi in the late 90s and was also very humble, so he wasn't a big self-promoter. And Charlie decided in his retirement, although retirement is an oxymoron for a guy like Charlie, to write a book about Callaway. And he started it as a biography, but when he sent it to me to look at, my reaction was, this is not a biography, it's a leadership book. And it's not a leadership book just aimed at big company leaders, it's a leadership book that is timeless, that works for entrepreneurs, that talks about the crossover between entrepreneurship and innovation and large companies and the dynamics around leadership. And he tuned it up, and I've become very intrigued with, and I think the two of us have become very fascinated with the idea of how do we talk about leadership in a way, especially for entrepreneurs in a context where they're either dealing with large companies or dealing with very rapidly scaling companies where leadership really, really matters. And vice versa, how do large companies think about the dynamics of leadership and leadership around dealing with small companies, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So that's the setup for the conversation. Let me start. Charlie, talk a little bit about, from your frame of reference, the journey you were on with Callaway and what some of those principles were, how that worked and how that unfolded.
Yeah, I think can you hear me okay? Okay. I think like Brad said, I started out not to write a leadership book, but to really just chronicle Callaway. His wife actually came and talked to me about he's fading from people's minds, and I didn't think that was right. And his leadership principles were very, very simple. So I started writing it. Even if you just sold it within PepsiCo, PepsiCo has 400,000 employees. It'd be the New York Times bestseller. So I wasn't thinking about much beyond that. But I started really thinking about the need for a leadership renaissance at every level, right? Nations, companies, institutions. I mean, this is not a time not to have leadership. And, when I left school in the mid-'60s, I joined IBM when IBM was about 75,000 people. And I was there for 15 years. And I would call that the Watson School of Growth, Leadership Development, because he was running the company, and the company got to be 250,000 people, right, during that era. And people were given opportunities when they were 28, 29 years old, running big pieces of the business because we had to, right? And it was very exciting, and that growth was just a tremendous place to be and a tremendous place to learn. And people were thrown in the deep end, but with a lot of support, right? And that was kind of the first 15 years of my career. I left there in 1980, and IBM was just kind of leveling off during that period of time, and joined PepsiCo and started working for Callaway. And again, his whole mantra was growth, right? Growth is like oxygen. If you grow, you attract the best people. If you attract the best people, you grow. It's as simple as that, right? So I spent the first 28 years of my career working in two big leadership companies. And then I launched out to start my business, which was a CIO turnaround company. And I went into companies like Westinghouse and Delta and Burlington Northern and realized that they didn't have those structures in there, and that the oldest person got to be the leader, right, as opposed to the best person. And there were, the opportunities just weren't there, and on and on. So, I really became infatuated with the idea that leadership matters. And we went in with 5 people, took over IT organizations with 5,000 people, and those 5,000 people came to life. And they started performing at higher levels. So, outsourcing the people and the machines was one model, but then usually didn't fix it. Outsourcing the leadership and getting a new leadership team in does. So I think very few people can make a huge difference. And the thing that intrigued me about the conversation I had with Brad is the leadership model that Callaway had, and you read about in the book, was pretty simple, right? If you can say it in kind of three things, you can kind of remember it, right? One is a leader needs to set the agenda, right? So where are we going? What are we going to do at every level, right? The second is you got to build a great team because people matter. Talent matters. Culture matters. Leadership matters, right? You give me, 4,000 people, I won't be able to get anything done. You give me 100 people and I might move the world, right? It's not about that. So set an agenda, build a great team, and then deliver with consistency, right? And, as we started talking about the book, Brad has lived by an analog to that in the entrepreneurial world that is very similar, right? So we began to get pretty excited about this is not about big corporate leaders or governors or, presidents of nations or whatever. It's about leadership at every level. So.
How many of you are familiar with Fred Wilson's post on the 3 things a great CEO has to do? Anyone? A couple people? So Fred, who's a partner at Union Square Ventures, longtime friend, very, very successful VC. If you don't know Fred, he was sort of most recently famous for being one of the early investors in Twitter, but many other things beyond that. He wrote a great post 5 years ago, and he said in that post, if you want to be a great CEO, there are 3 things you have to do. Great CEOs could do lots of other things, 50 other things that you could do if you're a great CEO. But unless you do these 3 things, you cannot be a great CEO. All the other stuff is bonus points. And those 3 things are, first, this is of an entrepreneurial high-growth company. First is set the vision and the strategy for everyone. So all your stakeholders, anybody involved in the company or that the company touches in any way, shape, or form. Number 2, get the right people on the team. And not just get the right people on the team at the beginning, but as your company grows and changes, continue to have the right people on the team. Most leadership teams of companies that are high-growth companies will turn over at least 3 times between inception and an IPO. And it doesn't mean that the CEO turns over 3 times, but different people in different parts of the leadership team will turn over. So as a CEO, you constantly have to be working on getting the right people on the team, the leadership level. And the third is don't run out of money. Those 3. If you don't do those 3 things, you won't be a great CEO. So set the agenda, articulate the strategy and the vision. Same thing. Get the right people on the team. Get the right people on the team. It sounds about the same. Deliver with results, with consistency. Don't run out of money. Different contexts, basically the same thing. So it was interesting, that parallel between those 2 dynamics of leadership. And as Charlie has said, many of the most important things are simple. And at some level, it sounds simple, but it caused me to get sucked into this dynamic of timelessness of certain things. Mm-hmm. So in the book, Charlie talks very clearly about this dynamic of his arc of 50 years. Right? We're sitting with a guy who was here at basically the very beginning of introduction of computers into a business context, 1966. I was 1. And if you think about what's happened over the last 50 years and how much we like to talk about how things have changed and how technology has changed and how everything is different, you think about the principles of leadership and how timeless they are. That's very powerful. However, it's not that things are unchanging. Mm-hmm. And I'd love you to talk about some of what your observation is around what happened in the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and the dynamics from where you sit as a longtime leader in business versus many people who are, whether they're young leaders or emerging leaders in business, or somebody like me who straddled both sides of that. Mm-hmm.
What happened?
Yeah, I think that I took the change of control when HP bought EDS in 2008. If you want to know what luck is about, the deal went down with HP August 25th, and the market went upside down middle of September, right? My wife and I are off, and
He retired. Change of control means they gave him a bunch
Yeah.
of money and he went away.
I was 66 and I was done, right? And then, from that point forward, I wanted to stay involved and engaged, and I became so focused on the fact that when the downturn happened, there was one other big event that went on at the same time, and that the smartphone showed up, right? I think people are pretty confused about what's going on here because they think we're just kind of having a bad time, right? But we slipped into the next era while all that was going. It had been building for 20 years, but the downturn, if anything, just accelerated the change. But all of these crises of unemployment and of shifts happened during that period of time. And I feel like more has changed in business at the intersection of technology in the last 5 years, 6 years, than it's changed in the first 45 years of my career. And people are walking around and they're missing what's going on. And they're missing what's going on because in corporations, people are focused on the next quarter. You don't make the next quarter, you don't get to play, right? So they're driving this, looking at the hood ornament, driving down the road saying, next quarter, governments, nations, next poll, next election. Not so bad when you're inside of an era like an industrial era, right? But pretty dangerous when we just turned a very sharp corner, right? And Callaway had the notion of a telescope has two ends. He drove double-digit growth at PepsiCo for over 20 years of revenue and profit during oil embargoes, when you had 30,000 route trucks and all that stuff going on and you can't get fuel, it's a problem. You would think that'd be an excuse. No excuse, right? Recessions, 18% interest rates, all of that stuff played through it. And he had the notion that, a good leader to set the agenda has to use both ends of the telescope. You got to kind of look down the road and see where you're going, right? Which a lot of people do a pretty good job of setting strategy. But then you've got to turn the telescope and look at where you are right now, because if you don't get the step forward a quarter at a time, you don't get to play, right? So it wasn't an either or, it was both. The reason I feel like it's so critical right now is that, at 10 miles an hour in 1950 on a straight road, right, looking up, looking down, looking up, looking down, it didn't matter. Not much would change. But at 90 miles an hour on a curvy road, if you're just looking here, you're going to miss what's happening. And that's really what's happening in large contexts around our K through 12 education, our energy policy, all the things that are the big agenda issues, down to, what did Blockbuster miss? What did Kodak miss? Where's Microsoft? Where are all these people? What are they thinking about in the short term? And we need to reinvent companies, institutions, and that's why I'm so excited about the entrepreneurial community, because that's where it's going to come from, right? And, the convergence of large companies and entrepreneurial companies, this Techstar accelerator things that you guys are working on, companies are going to be much more open in the next 5 years for new ideas, new innovation, because they can't keep doing this, right? So, we've met with both corporate folks who, get the message and don't like living in this short-term window, but have to, and also the entrepreneurs who really have a lot of exciting solutions coming, whether it's healthcare, education, business context, different applications, different networks, different ways of communicating, and so forth. So, it's been a great week of kind of a converging thought.
When you think about this time period, and I want to put a sharper focus on it, think back to 2008, 2009. that time period was one where the entire financial infrastructure was going to collapse, governments were going to fail, all banks were going to be regulated. MIT had a lot of thought leadership around that. Sloan had a lot of thought leadership around that. Simon Johnson was very outspoken. I think he, like me, was right about some things and wrong about some things, but he was always very loud and very effective in terms of that. I was at a Dean's Advisory meeting in New York that was happening within weeks of I think it was October, November of 2008, and we were in the basement, I think, of the Four Seasons, if I remember correctly, and every single person in that meeting, except for like 3 of us, were dejected. My company's going out of business. I just lost all my wealth. All the real estate stuff is collapsing. I'm part of this investment bank that, I was at Bear Stearns for 30 years and now it's gone. Like that kind of thing was going on. That was the tone. And when I reflect on the startups that I was working with and the entrepreneurs I was working with during that period of time, many of them didn't even notice. Right? If you think about iconic names today, Facebook started 2004, big growth in that time period. Twitter started 2005. LinkedIn started 2005. Even companies that people could point at and said have fallen from grace, like Zynga, which I was on the board of, still a $3 billion market cap company, started in 2007. So just a really remarkable amount of entrepreneurial activity, while at the same time in this global macro, just total and complete panic, freak out, and collapse. Charlie talked about it being this inflection point of a change. And my view is that we went from the industrial era and the era where a hierarchy dominated in the context of business to a post-industrial era. Some people call it information era. I heard the phrase imagination era yesterday, digital era. I don't really care what label it is, but we went through into this new construct. And it's a construct where the network dominates instead of the hierarchy. So if you think about hierarchies have been around since the beginning of time, right? Government's a hierarchy, military's a hierarchy, religion's a hierarchy. In the Industrial Revolution, hierarchy was created to organize labor. And for those of you, that have paid attention and studied the Industrial Revolution, I hope, when I was here a long time ago, we were still talking about the Industrial Revolution and fantasizing about the information era. Hopefully we still talk about the Industrial Revolution lessons from it, but the fundamental lesson, or the fundamental organizing principle of the Industrial Revolution was that we organized labor through a hierarchy. And labor was humans. It didn't matter whether they died or not. If you had humans died, you just got more. And the hierarchy helped you organize the use of that labor and leverage the use of that labor. Well, that model carried through. Obviously, Sloan applied it to beyond just the physical labor side of it. And that's roots of where we are today. But the idea of hierarchies developing in business is a way to scale organizations around communication, around people, around management structures, around functional structures, became the norm. In the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, that became the dominant approach to business. 1980s, 1990s, there were a lot of premises about how information was going to change that. Then there was the dissatisfaction with the productivity paradox was the phrase that was being used. And then the internet was going to change everything in 1997, 1998, 1999, dramatic change. 2000, 2001, internet collapse. Oops, that was interesting, but didn't really have any impact on anything. But by 2003, 2005, 2004, much of what had happened in the 90s had finally caught up with the aspiration of what was going on. And there was this aspiration of something that was changing very dramatically. In 1990, if you mentioned the word network to people, most people had no idea what you're talking about, some kind of academic construct. Today, if we talk about a network, we all know what a network is because we use Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter as a proxy for how a network works. It's how our social interactions are. I would make the strong assertion that in 2009, we transitioned where hierarchies dominated in the context of business to where networks now dominate. Hierarchies are still important. There's still lots of them around. They'll be around forever. But the notion of a network where your organization, your corporation, and your way of making progress through an organization is not up a hierarchy, but by actively connecting to other nodes on a network, which might be inside your company, might be outside your company, especially as an entrepreneur, but not exclusively as an entrepreneur. And the number of connections you have is not what determines the size of your node. It's the amount of activity across those connections. So in a hierarchy, you gain more power by absorbing the norms of the organization, by marching up the hierarchy, by your node getting bigger as you have more power, as you get higher in the hierarchy. In a network, you have a node, and if you have lots of connections, but no activity across those connections, your node stays very small. You're irrelevant. And if you have very few connections, even with a lot of activity across very few connections, your node stays small. So you're trying to optimize for a good number of connections and a lot of activity across those connections. And so that dynamic is starting to really infiltrate. It leads to something that's very interesting in the construct of leadership, which to me, when I read this book, hit me over the head really, really hard, which is all about who do you want to be working with and who do you want to be learning from on your career, whether you're in a network or in a hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And I'd love you to talk some about that experience of what you got from great leaders like Callaway and how that informed you versus the natural default, which is you got lucky. Your first job was in Watson's IBM.
Right.
Your first job wasn't in Acres IBM, which was an IBM in distress and in decline. So you got lucky, but how can somebody that's in business school, somebody who's starting a company, somebody that's at the earlier phase of their career be deliberate about making those choices?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think the future is going to be invented by people in this room of this age, right? Because it's about competitiveness and it's about thinking differently. I will tell you, so many of my peers are trying to understand what he just said. But it's different when you kind of grow up with it and you can sense it. And so much of it is tied to this notion of, I heard somebody talk about, and I brought it up yesterday, this imagination age. Because his point was that it's interesting that if you could imagine it, you can build it now. Right? I mean, we're not in the way. We're so close to curing cancers. We're so close with genomes. We're so close to the ability to change manufacturing paradigms and so forth. But it's going to come from this next generation. And, the problem is you've got to be pretty careful about the jobs, the roles you get here going forward, that you don't get stifled in one thing, right? That you get a broader view and have more of an impact in that company. Large corporations are pretty difficult right now, right? Many of them are starting to go private in order to be able to do it. It's not like they don't get it. It's just they can't survive the cure. So as you go forward, and you start looking at where do you go from here, there's a notion of, I might get this much money if I go here, but I might get this kind of experience and be surrounded by these kind of people as I go here, right? And, when I joined IBM, it never crossed my mind that I would not retire from IBM, just the way it was, right? I had 5 different careers. Many people are going to have many, many different careers. And the fact is, you are your career, right? As your ability to go from place to place. So surrounding yourself with environments of, people that give you opportunity, of, companies that, invest in you to learn, that take chances, right? I mean, Roger Enrico was running Pepsi-Cola of Japan at 27 years old. Right? I mean, you don't have to wait, but you've got to come out of it with an optimism that nothing's going to get in the way. Right? This next era is about reinventing competitiveness, not about keeping the pie this size and figuring out how I can hold on to it, because the interesting dynamic is, even though we've declared the industrial era, over, most emerging countries are going through their own industrialization right now. They're coming off the farms and going into the plants, right? And the more they can come off the farms and go into the plants and go through their industrial era, we need to provide the leadership of products and services and, new things that are going on. So I'm very optimistic about the future based on this next generation, not of the people that are, running IT organizations or companies right now, And, who you hang out with matters a lot, right? In terms of what impact you can have over a period of time. Callaway had, two themes. He had kind of three principles and two themes. One was results, but results with integrity, right? Not results at any cost, right? Are you building something? Are you moving things? And integrity was not just not lying and honesty. It was, can I trust you? Can the people that work for you trust you? Are you going to say what, do what you're going to say? Are you going to raise your hand when you got trouble? And in order to create that environment, he created thousands of P&Ls in PepsiCo, right? And I think as you read the book, you'll see that he believes so deeply that in order for us to grow, we're not going to run out of financial capital. We're going to run out of human capital first, right? We've got to get enough general managers, enough people that can run a business. And therefore, to do that, we've got to create many, many P&Ls as opposed to here. Most companies are moving to that right now, as opposed to central command, control, hierarchies. And it's a little unnerving for my generation of people to kind of let go of that control and yet still have to make quarter to quarter. So it's really an interesting time, for people to be, emerging into their careers. And I know some of you have had work experience, back to school, and now you go out again. Just don't look for the next job. Look for the adventure of it all if you can.
Awesome. We've got a few more minutes. I think we can do a couple of questions if people have some. Bill told me to make sure you ask your questions so that they end with a question mark.
Hi, my name is Rajat. I'm a second year MBA. So my question is around the future of leadership, and it's more surrounded around breaking the meta narratives, and this generation is aggressively looking into that. And for example, we are not worried about capital at all. We have so much sense of amplified self that we cannot take the CEO for granted or his leadership for granted. He has to work at par with me and appreciate and respect me as a self in itself. So how do you see that Callaway's leadership or all the other leaders that you've quoted would stay relevant? Their principles would stay relevant in the next 10, 20 years? Thank you.
So I think the Callaway question's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And Charlie, why don't you riff on this for a sec? I think Callaway would be an extraordinary leader today.
Yep. Yeah, I think, he never felt like he had to have the answers. He felt that he had to hire people, right? So even though he knew enough about marketing, he hired the best marketing people from the best schools, right? Even though he felt like he needed to know enough about manufacturing and distribution and, sales, he didn't feel like he had to be the dominant player, right? So, it was interesting because I'm kind of a go-forward person. I don't go back. So when I left IBM, I really never went back. I stayed at Frito-Lay and Pepsi. When I left Frito and Pepsi to form my company, I didn't go back, and on and on. But this has been a venture. This is the first time I've gone backward to see how things evolved, and it was pretty good retrospective. But one of the experiences I had is I walked into the Frito-Lay building in Dallas a couple of years ago, and it was eerie because when I walked into it, the people that were in the building were about the same age as when I had left it 20 years earlier. I expected to see people I knew with gray hair and, hey, how's it going, Joe? And I mean, they churn the company so much with talent, right? That there are people that are your age running big pieces of Frito-Lay and PepsiCo, right? As opposed to other companies I've been in, and I don't want to name them, but it's truly people that have been locked into those big roles for 20, 30 years. They're never going to get it. So he didn't feel like he had to have it, but he was never threatened by people that were smarter than him, more aggressive than him, right? And people that can create the future. And he took chances with them, right? He gave them the opportunity. And in a lot of cases, and you'll see a couple in the book, that, people failed, right? Not the end of the world. Get up and go. You can't grow if you're not willing to take chances, and you can't grow if you're not willing to bet on the talent. So, just the ability, whether it's a sports team or a company or a cabinet, of a government, having really good eye for talent and bringing in the best and brightest and not being threatened by, I don't want to say it, but people like Brad, right? I mean, not exactly the typical corporate look, but I think Callaway would have liked Brad a lot.
I'll add to that. I've worked with many hundreds of CEOs, probably 1,000 at this point, in all the different entrepreneurial companies I've been involved in, ranging in age from very young to in their 60s. The spectrum, if I think about it, there's been an extraordinary range from people who are unbelievably effective to people who are horrifyingly bad. And I would not say that there's a correlation to a specific this and therefore they're good and that and therefore they're bad, other than what I would describe as self-inquiry of the leader. So the leaders who are on a continual self-inquiry, they're constantly trying to understand themselves in the context of whatever they're doing and the businesses that they're part of and the people that they're around. Those leaders outperform. Leaders who have no curiosity, who know the way, who are unwilling to be on that inquiry. And again, I use the word self importantly because it's driven first by your own inquiry, tend to be very ineffective. I think you're at business school. There's lots and lots of different theories of leadership. There's lots of different theories of management. There's lots of different tactics. I think there are lots of things that work in different ways and lots of things that don't work, and they change, and some things come in and out of favor at different points in time. That self-inquiry of a leader is what tends to have a person evolve and inspire. So the styles can be very different, but the absence of that tends to be very toxic. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Ben. Thank you for talking to us. Would you be able to give some principles around corporate culture, hiring right, and then maybe about the distinction between leadership and management, if you make such a distinction?
Sure. Let me talk about culture quickly, especially in the context of a young company, because I think that it's easy to understand in a young company and how it maps to a company that has grown and matured. One of the things that's so amazing about entrepreneurship is this theory or this thesis that you get to create your own thing. You get to create your own business, and it's not just the product, but the business ultimately, as you start to have success, becomes the product that you're creating. Right? You think about the overall business as the thing rather than, what individual product you're creating. The mistake that many entrepreneurs make is they get infatuated with this idea of creating the product and then creating a culture, but in the abstract. They don't view that every incremental person you add to the company is impacting and modifying the culture. And that as the company gets bigger and bigger, the norms that you develop in the company essentially become the defining characteristics of the culture. And what I find often is that companies wake up and they're at 50 people or 100 people, and there's this huge disconnect between the cultural values that the leader or the founders espouse and the instantiation of those values in the company. And most companies go through a real crisis at that point, and some come out of the crisis with a very clear understanding of their culture, and they solve that particular crisis and carry on, and others causes those companies to stall, fragment, change, whatever. That dynamic, in my experience, happens over and over and over and over again as a business grows. So, there are many, many examples of companies that had very, very significant changes in norms and cultural dynamics when they hit 1,000 people on the growth path to 2,000, or at 2,000 on the path to 4,000. And we hear this all the time, and I'm sure plenty of you have worked in those companies. Interestingly, if you take that back to this notion of leadership, there's a very, very simple construct, which is working in the business versus working on the business. And it's very parallel to the telescope story. Right? When I read the telescope story, that's my entrepreneurial equivalent of looking through both ends of the telescope. As a CEO of a company, how much time are you working in the business versus working on the business? And most entrepreneurs spend way too much time working in the business than on the business. At the very beginning, you have nothing else to do but work in the business because it's you and a couple of people. When you're 25 people, you spend a little bit of time working on the business, but probably still too much time working in the business because you don't have the right leaders. At 50 people, hopefully you're starting to spend some real time working on the business. And if you are, the very first thing you're going to realize is you've got some of the wrong leaders on the team, which kind of sucks because it means you got to fire them, and that means you have to work more in the business as you get to working more on the business, right? Constantly switching between these two roles. A great leader is able to move seamlessly between those two zones. You're able to be in one place where you're thinking about the business and working on it, and then be confronted with a problem or a crisis or an issue that might be very specific among sub-segment of the business and be able to work with the person or people and go deep in that. I think that scales all the way up to very, very large companies. And when I think about the large company CEOs that I know that have crises or large companies that lose their way, it's exactly that disconnect. It's the inability to see what's going on, to set the agenda, to make sure that the right people are on the team, and to make sure that you're delivering across those right people. Just, you know, if you said to me a month ago before or 2 months ago before I read the book, what were the 3 principles of leadership in a large company, it wouldn't have occurred to me that it's exactly the same principles of leadership in a small company. Now, you asked the question of difference between leadership and management, and it's probably an hour-long conversation. I'll end with the punchline of, I think we talk over and over again, especially in the world of entrepreneurship, about the distinction between leadership and management. I'm not going to say this as a conclusion. I'm going to make the assertion that if you're focused on it from the perspective of a CEO, I think we overvalue the distinction. I think that they're much more tightly coupled. And people get tangled up in the style difference rather than the impact difference. Because a great entrepreneurial CEO has to be an effective leader and manager, even if that CEO only has one person reporting to him, which is the COO, or 2 people reporting to them, which is the COO and the CFO. Because that CEO is an ineffective operating manager. But they can still be a very effective manager if they get the right people on the team and continue to turn the telescope both directions and help the people below them. If they're a great operating manager, it's a different style. So I'm struggling with that personally in terms of looking across companies. I've seen so many companies that I've been involved in get to a certain point and the standard shtick is, okay, you're 1,000 people, you need to hire the right kind of executive, or you don't have the right kind of CEO here because you don't know how to scale a business like this. It's not that. It's almost that you have some CEOs who are great salespeople, some CEOs who are great at finance, some CEOs who are great at product. And as the business gets bigger and bigger, you have to make sure you have all 3 of those strengths, either sitting in the CEO's chair or sitting around and next to the CEO. And that's still the CEO's responsibility to make sure those strengths are there. And if the CEO can't get those strengths there, then he's not being an effective manager, whether or not he combines those. I don't know if you want to have the last word, and then we got to...
Yeah. No, I mean, the only thing I would say in these large corporations with 400,000 people, the thought of managing a company on a global scale with that many people, the Pepsi system was he personally managed 500 leaders who had to manage 500 leaders, right? And the pyramid of decentralizing the responsibility put a lot of pressure on having the right 10 leaders to the 500 leaders. And when you read through the book, the number of people he interviewed and was part of the decision as to whether they got hired or promoted was incredible. That's where he spent his time. And everything else, he just, took care of itself.
So last comment as Bill says goodbye to us. One, enjoy the book. Charlie put a lot of effort into it. I think it's really powerful. It's an easy read. Request for anybody who enjoys the book, put up a review on Amazon, tweet about it, put up a review on Goodreads. Bill will tell you. It's a joy of every great author to see that stuff come in. And if you don't like the book, just don't tell anyone.
Email me.
You can tell me, because I'd like to know.
But do it on email. Not on Amazon. Look, this has been fabulous. I just want to make 3 quick comments here before we go. Sorry? Here. They can hear me. Can't you hear me? No. Videotaping it. Okay, then maybe you don't want to. I just want to make 3 quick comments. I grew up. I didn't realize he worked at IBM. I was in Watson's IBM too. You're supposed to say you don't look that old.
You don't.
Thank you. Whenever I ask people to say that, they say it. And there was George Thorogood. I don't know if you know George Thorogood. George Thorogood and the Destroyers, they were music. And someone said, why don't you write your own songs? And he said, because Chuck Berry already wrote all the good ones. And I say that because the timelessness of what's going on here. I worked at IBM, and I still have that book, A Business and Its Beliefs, by Thomas Watson.
Yep, absolutely.
And I carry it around, and I use it today on the problems with people who look like this, right? And one of his, these are colors not found in nature, just so you know. But Thomas Watson had one, I quote this all the time, from Kierkegaard. He said, a business must have its wild ducks. A business must have its wild ducks. And Thomas Watson would sit here looking like this, and he'd have some crazy person here looking like this. And I mean that in the most positive sense, you understand. And he understood that to be innovative, you had to have diversity. You had to have wild ducks. And we talk about this all the time in ours. And so the things that we're learning, before are truly timeless. And it's great, the leadership. I see Lee here. I don't know who else from the Leadership Center. But the stuff that we're trying to teach you here is this leadership. And I cannot wait to read this book. This is really going to be outstanding. And the last comment that Brad made that I really want to reemphasize is, you see great leaders. Trust us. We're old. Well, we're old, I guess.
I'm edging up.
Yeah, old keeps moving further out. Yay, here, Dean Pounds, you're here with us too. You're with us, all right. Are you awake? But over time, you will see that it's not, as Darwin said, it's not the most intelligent, it's not the strongest that survives, it's the one that adapts to change. And the one that adapts to change is the one who has the self-inquiry that Brad was talking about. It's the one who doesn't take themselves too seriously, but goes out and studies leadership through books, through movies, through sitting there and watching people at meetings, how they operate and what happens out of it. And I would encourage you, that's what we're about. We're about teaching you. And if this thing today helped you in that regard, I am so happy. But it's only the beginning, and hopefully the book will create that. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's good we had...
Thank you so much.
Great, this is awesome. This is awesome.